Hello everyone, Zach here for another video on alchemy. This is video number 6, and this one, as well as the next, will be discussing the dynamics of being. I've broken that into 2 parts to help it to be a little bit more digestible. So in this video, we're going to be focusing on the dynamics of our individual being, seeking to explore how our being is comprised of layers, with the goal of seeing how each of these layers is not compartmentalized, but rather in a constant, energetic, dynamic interplay with all the other layers of our being. So, that being said, what are the layers of our being? When I assess, I see that we have a physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual layer of our being. We could explore further and say that we have a reflection of that goes internal as well as external, but that overcomplicates it a little bit more than necessary at this time. Like I said initially, the primary point here is that everything is interconnected. What we do in our body, what we do in our mind, what we do in our emotion, and what we do with our spirit are all interconnected. Now, when I say that, it is not to suggest that each is an instant holographic reflection of one another. If we make a change in the body, it doesn't immediately reflect a change in every other layer. It ripples, essentially. It causes changes in the other layers, but that's not to say that it's instantaneous, and it's also not to say that it causes an absolute change in any other. So, why is this important to know, and how does it relate to alchemy? When we have this awareness in mind, it brings forth the idea that the quest of one is the quest for all. So what does that mean exactly? If we are driven to propel our mind or to reach emotional contentment, the awareness of the dynamic aspects of our being can help us to remember that to achieve what we seek, to achieve mental clarity, to achieve emotional peace, relies on a quest to truly explore and refine all aspects of our being, because we cannot truly reach that emotional perfection and that or mental perfection or anything without addressing all the other layers of our being. When encountering this idea, this can either be daunting or inspiring, and I hope to encourage you all to be inspired by this rather than find it daunting. You could say that, oh, this is so complex. This is it's too much, and see it as a weight. So to fix my mind, I've got to fix everything in my life, and that can be daunting. But the power comes back to us and our own intentions. To just make one little positive change will affect all the aspects of our being. And when we look at it this way, it's really easy to be inspired by this idea. So please don't be too overwhelmed, but rather assess what you want, find one little change that you can make to move towards that goal, and then implement that change. And then study the responses and become further fueled and inspired by the responses that you're seeing. A couple of examples that I wrote out about how this works to really explore the implications are we're going to look at each of the 4 layers: the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. So let's say the physical, let's look at a change in the body. So let's say we eat really good. Let's say we're eating really good for a year or something, What's that going to do? When our body reaches a state of peace, it translates to a change in our mind. Our mind is able to be more lucid. And that's pretty obvious because the mind is reliant on the brain, and the brain is an organ which is connected to the body. So nourishment is obviously going to affect brain health. So we can see a change in the mind. Now, if we're treating our body very good, how will our emotions change? Obviously, our emotions are going to be more content and more peaceful because our body is experiencing peace. then spiritually, the more that we take care of our bodies, the more spiritually receptive we become. The spiritual part is kind of the most difficult to convey in words because a lot of aspects of spirit are somewhat ineffable. But what I would like to convey is that spiritual energy or spiritual connectedness, in my assessment, seems to relate to a sense of, like I said, receptivity or non-receptivity, a connectedness to a sensation of the divine, but also it affects potentials. There's always potentials in our life to go one way or another, and depending on how we are, vibrating spiritually, if you want to say, or how we are in harmony with reality or in harmony with spiritual patterns around us, that will dictate and greatly affect the way that things potentialize. So, in terms of the body, let's look at something being negative. Let's say we're just eating trash or, doing drugs or something that's going to damage the body ultimately. That's going to cause a mental clutter. That's going to cause emotional discord. And then that's going to cause not only a lack of receptivity to spiritual experience, but it's also going to bring about disharmonious potentialization, bring about the possibility of disease and these different things. The mind. Let's say that all the other aspects of our being are consistent, and then we're going to cause a change in the mind. So if we are thinking positive and we are doing whatever that brings about a sensation of peace in our mind, what's that going to do? To the body, the sensation of peace and contentment is going to bring about changes in our heart rate and our blood pressure, which are harmonious for our body. The blood pressure will regulate somewhat, the heart rate will regulate, everything starts to function. Our immune system also is greatly affected. Depending on what we do in our mind, it's going to cause direct changes in our body's chemistry. And for me, that was one of the first realizations I really had on my quest for developing meditation and just awareness in general. I was like, wow, it's pretty powerful to really think how much we are changing the way our body works just from what we're doing with our lives. So maybe that'll resonate with you guys as well. But if we are experiencing these positive thoughts, our emotions are also going to translate to that. You're thinking positive things, your emotions get excitement, you start feeling that fuel rushing through you. And the same thing spiritually. Those positive thoughts will translate to spiritual receptivity and also positive potentials coming about in our life. The reverse of that, if we're experiencing resentment and negativity mentally, that's going to cause our heart to race, our blood pressure will spike to some degree, our immune system is going to get lower from that. We're going to experience emotional discord in relation to that resentment, and we're going to also be clouded spiritually. If we experience contentment and peace in terms of emotions, our body will stabilize, our immune system will function well, our mind will work fluidly, and we will also have generally positive and productive thoughts, and then our emotional or our spiritual harmony will also prosper. If we experience anger, you can see that we experience those same symptoms physically as we do to having mental discord. Our blood pressure and heart rate will change. The stress we experience will lower our immune system, and ultimately it will open us up to experiencing disease or sickness. And that's not only physical but also spiritual, in my opinion, the fact that we would become susceptible to those potentials. And then the final one would be exploring the spirit. And if we are experiencing spiritual harmony and we are in line spiritually, we will have emotional clarity, we will have mental fluidity, as well as physical prosperity, whereas spiritual discord will translate to emotional struggle, mental friction, and physical ailment. Now, like I said earlier on in the video, each of these changes is not an immediate absolute translation to all other aspects, but it does implement change, and those ripples will keep going out. So just one little negative slip up, we don't need to beat ourselves up about it. We experience resentment, we experience, all these things are natural. These things that are discord do come up naturally, but the way that we respond and the way that we adapt to those is what's really important, because we're bound to experience discord as well as bound to experience positivity and harmony regularly. But the larger picture of how we program ourselves to respond to these things and how well we are able to integrate life changes that bring about harmony or disharmony for all these layers of our being is really what's going to dictate the health of our being throughout a long period of time. The last thing I want to touch on before ending this video, the part one, is going to be using this to really fuel our drive and fuel our ability to perform alchemical refinement on our being. So each of us has different drives, like I mentioned earlier. Some people particularly want their mind to, they value intellect, have a scientific disposition, and they want their mind to be functioning well. The same with artists in a lot of regard. You want your mind to be at its peak potential. Other people are more focused on emotional peace and contentment. Some people are focused on spiritual development. So it's beautiful that we all have these individual drives, but when we connect these dots and we see that we are a dynamic being, we can use the fuel that we have inherently to seek that mental prowess and extend that to being a drive to enhance all the aspects of our being. Because to achieve that mental prowess, we need to nurture the body. We need to nurture the emotions, nurture the spiritual alignment. Only by completing development, or not completing, but by striving for development on all layers of our being, are we able to achieve that thing that is our inherent drive. So it's almost like fuel for a fire. I can use my ambition to achieve this emotional clarity and use that fuel to potentially trudge through the things that I find maybe less enjoyable, like somebody who doesn't care about what they eat, but they're real concerned about experiencing emotional lucidity and peace. Well, we can use that fuel, that drive that we have inherent in us to seek that emotional clarity and extend it to, it almost allows us to go into autopilot in terms of disciplining other aspects of our being. Well, I want emotional peace. I don't care about what I eat, but I know that what I eat is going to translate to changes in my emotions, so let me go ahead and tweak this, and this. So it's pretty obvious how all the changes interact with one another. And I think that it's really important to keep this in mind so that we can achieve alchemical refinement of our being in a way which is harmonious and beneficial and desirable to our own unique dispositions. The only final thing to say is you might be asking yourself, well, this is all about self and the individual. What about those of us that have a selfless drive, okay? And that's going to be touched on in the second video in particular. This is addressing the dynamics of our being as an individual, but our being is always an interconnected relation to what is outside of us. There is really no limitation. So the next video will be about microcosmic and macrocosmic reflections, and it will be the second part of this exploration of the dynamic interplay of being. So have a blessed progression, my friends.